I'm not as good with technology as my age may portray. A lot of older people think that because I'm young, I'm going to be really great with figuring out computers and Zoom and everything else, and that's simply not the case for me. But I'm glad that you are here with us. We're starting just a couple minutes late, but that's okay. I'm sure y'all will forgive me. I may just have to let class out a couple minutes early, I guess, to make up for it. But um, we are in this study of biblical geography. We have began each class thus far with a prayer. We definitely want to ask for God's favor and God's presence as we're going to be studying His Word, His story, and the geography of it. But before we pray, are there any things or any people that we need to lift up this afternoon, evening? Okay, if there's not any, that is perfectly okay. That's good news a lot of times when it comes to prayer requests. So we'll just give prayers of thanksgiving that there aren't any situations or loved ones that need our prayers, that everybody's doing good. So we'll go ahead and pray, and then we'll make our way into our content for this lesson. If you would, please pray with me. Our God and our Father, you are good. We are humbled to be able to be in your presence. We feel your love, your embrace, and your provision every single day. We thank you for your good word. We thank you for the eternal truths that we can build our lives on. Thank you for the way that we can share this with each other and can grow together. Please be with each and every person that is currently watching this. Be with all those that will watch this and try to grow from it. Lord, I pray that they are able to see you most of all, grow deeper in their relationship and their knowledge with you most of all. We pray that you are glorified above all else, as that's our chief purpose and goal in this life and in this study. Thank you for our loved ones and families. Please watch over them, grant them safety, help us to be the examples and the shining lights that we need to be, the salt of the earth that we need to be. And may we be people that emulate and embody you in all that we do. Lord, it would be our honor for the world to see you through us. And we thank you for Jesus and pray all this in Him. Amen. Okay. It has been a good course so far. I guess after today, we're halfway done with biblical geography. And as we have mentioned, each class up until this point, um, we are going to work kind of chronologically through Scripture, work step by step through the story of God's people. And as I'm trying to get everything adjusted here on my end, I had to rearrange some things in my office to be able to set up to record. As we're getting into the time wandering in the wilderness, we're going to cover today from Exodus through Second Chronicles, from Exodus to Second Chronicles, and so we will kind of conclude with a little bit of a transition, conclude with a little bit of a cliffhanger that's going to keep us waiting for next Tuesday, where we will get into the exile, the exilic and post-exilic period. But there's a lot to cover between now and then. We're going to pick up where we left off 2 days ago, looking at the Israelites coming out of Egypt under the leadership of Moses and into the Sinai desert and the Sinai wilderness. If you have a Bible with you, that would be a good place to go ahead and pick up. If you want to look, and we'll start in Exodus 14. Exodus 14 with the parting of the Red Sea. But as you are kind of turning there, we will familiarize ourselves really, really briefly with an overview of kind of God's plan. Keep in mind, at this point, God's people, the Israelites, haven't fully been revealed this plan yet for the land of Canaan. They know that he has promised them a land that he is going to show them and that he's going to give to them. But in terms of the exact details of how they're going to take it, how they're going to acquire it, I don't believe at the moment of their departure they fully understand yet. There's, again, a lot of unknowns, and part of the reason for those unknowns is to create, as we've talked about, I think the last 2 weeks, to create dependency on God and to create trust in God to provide. So we're beginning with kind of almost from the perspective of here's what God knows that God's people in coming out of Egypt don't yet fully know. Looking at the conquering of the promised land. So looking at, I'm sorry, where are we at? My bad, my bad. I was starting in the wrong place. So Exodus to Second Chronicles, looking at the wandering in the wilderness, going to your Bible lands map here on page one. My apologies for again. I was starting on the wrong page. We are looking at this general vicinity. See, Egypt's right here. They're coming up out of Egypt into the Sinai desert. It's also, you notice on this map, which we talked about in the very first class, there's going to be a lot of maps and a lot of times where the same place has multiple names. So on this particular map, it's called the Arabian Peninsula or the Peninsula of Arabia. So as we're looking at the Arabian desert, and remember, right around here is the Fertile Crescent from Babylonia all the way down through Syria and into the land of Canaan. But this area right here is actually going to be the majority of the entire setting of Exodus through Second Chronicles. So as we're studying, realize that looking at the Bible land maps as a whole, Bible lands map as a whole, we have the Mediterranean Sea here as our point of reference, and here's what we're going to be studying, beginning with them coming out of Egypt and into the wilderness right here. So the wilderness wanderings, from Exodus to Deuteronomy, I believe this kind of begins, at least from my perspective, it begins in Exodus 14, where you've turned in your Bibles. That's where the Red Sea is parted, which we'll talk about here in just a moment. And as they cross the Red Sea, that's kind of like the moment where they leave the terror. The wilderness that they're in, we talked about last week, is technically claimed by Egypt, and it's technically Egyptian territory. But as we said, since it's a desert and since it's a wilderness, there's nobody living there to actually occupy it and defend it, and there's no real reason why anybody would settle there. So I will kind of amend the statement I was about to make, or make my same statement with a little bit of an asterisk. They're technically leaving Egypt, but they are entering into a territory that Egypt claimed, the Sinai Desert, the Sinai Wilderness. But in terms of being bothered by the Egyptians, if you're familiar with the beginning of the book of Exodus, with the 10 plagues, and then followed by God miraculously parting the Red Sea and flooding and destroying the rest of the Egyptians. You can imagine that the Egyptians will not be a problem once Israel enters the wilderness. They do not want to mess with the people of God any more than they already have once they have finally fled and left Egypt. So leaving Egypt proper, crossing the Red Sea, going into the Sinai wilderness, which it is a claimed territory of Egypt, but not occupied by Egypt. It is kind of like a no man's land. You can claim land, but if you don't have anything there to defend it or keep it or people to settle it, then it's not really yours. You can just claim it by name, but there's no indication that it's yours. So that's what the Sinai wilderness would have been to Egypt, and kind of remained throughout the history of the ancient world. It was a desert. It was a no man's land. You can claim it, but it's not really yours unless you have somebody posted there. So the location of Mount Sinai in the wilderness is one of the first big questions that we'll look at and talk about. Like the Garden of Eden and like a lot of things that we've discussed in this class, ultimately there's a few potential locations, but we do not have a guarantee. There is not a position in this course, and there's not a position that I am going to take and say I believe this is where Mount Sinai is. There are too many plausible locations. We know kind of the mountainous range that it was within, and we go kind of it's not too far-fetched to assume that it would have been one of the highest points and one of the highest mountains in this mountain range. Um, but Mount Sinai is one of the most significant moments in the Bible. I believe it is the most significant event in the Old Testament because it is the moment where the old law is given. It's the moment where God reveals Himself to His people. And if you want to kind of know what that is called, um, a theophany. So Mount Sinai is a theophany. You won't need to know that for a quiz or anything, but as you're studying, you may read or come across this phrase. And a theophany is just simply an appearance of God. Whenever God appears, God interacts with His people. So that's what makes Mount Sinai so important to the history of God's people. The story of God's people. And that's why we are trying to kind of look at and study and see the general location where it is and a few different specific locations of where it could be. It is significant to who the Israelites are as people because this is where Moses is given the old law. The old law is renewed to the people once they enter into the promised land between two other mountains. So keep in mind, we are looking at Mount Sinai, but Mount Sinai kind of becomes representative of the covenant between God and His people. You'll notice when they renew the covenant, Deuteronomy 27 and Joshua 8, where do they do it? Between two mountains, because that kind of becomes the symbol or the image for God's covenant with His people. You look at the beginning of Jesus's ministry, Matthew 5 through 7. What do we often call that? The Sermon on the
Sermon on the Mount.
Matthew 5 through 7 is often referred to as the Sermon on the Mount. Again, there is this biblical connection between God's people, their covenant, and this type of location and this type of mountainous um, point where they meet with God. So coming out of the wilderness into the wilderness is, as we've talked about, the Israelites were taught to fully trust and fully depend on God for the very simplest of needs, manna, quail, water. And it is in this setting, starting in Exodus 16 and going all the way through Numbers, and you see Numbers 16, and it goes even further than that, it goes into Numbers 21, where time and time again the Israelites revolt against God's authority, and they are giving glimpses of victory while in the wilderness. So the significance of their time in the wilderness, they're dependent on God. They're taught not to revolt against God's authority, and they're shown that God will not just provide for them when it comes to food and water, but He will provide in giving them victory over their enemies as they're going to be called in the book of Joshua to take this land and drive out all of the inhabitants for their time in the wilderness. Below, and I'm right here on this note between these two pictures below, we see a portion of Israel's path in the wilderness. Note that there is little archaeological evidence of the Israelites in the wilderness. So, what that means is when archaeologists dig and study in the Sinai wilderness, in the Arabian Peninsula, as some would call it, they are not finding evidence of the Israelites that were traveling and wandering in the wilderness. And some skeptics will say that that is a reason to believe that the Bible is false or that the Bible is lying. My kind of counterpoint to that comes right here is I think it can very easily be explained by the lifestyle of God's people in the wilderness, which is called nomadic. They were never permanently settling anywhere which means they were living, traveling. They were living in tents. God's house, the tabernacle, was even in a tent. As they were traveling, they were taking everything that they needed with them, meaning that they weren't actually leaving any trace behind the way that a settled people would. They don't have buildings and structures that they're being housed in. They don't have set, distinct. One thing that is often used, it's a little bit, it can be a hair disgusting or gross, but archaeologists often love whenever they find the outhouse, the toilet, the bathroom of an ancient civilization, because from that they can discover a whole lot about how the people lived, how the people dieted, etc. And so from that one place, they can tell a lot about the culture. I know that can be a little bit off-putting or a little bit disgusting to us, but when trying to learn about a people, archaeologists really find a lot of value in uncovering that. Well, keep in mind, Israel never stayed in one place very long. There was no set dung heap outside of their city walls, because their city walls were often on the move. So as they're going into this nomadic lifestyle of having no home, living on the move, they leave Egypt and they cross the Red Sea. What's drawn for you right here with these red lines is two potential spots. Excuse me, two potential spots where Israel could have crossed the Red Sea, kind of over here, level closer to Pithom and Succoth, or down here parallel level with the capital city, Memphis or Noph. And as they're crossing one of these two places, we see the miracle that you've opened to, that you have in front of you in Exodus chapter 14, and they begin their southward travel. So they're traveling both down and up. We've talked about. So they're traveling downward in the fact that whenever we look at a map, we think of south as downward. But as they are approaching Sinai, they're also going upward in elevation, because they're entering into this mountainous region right here at the very tip of the peninsula, of the Sinai Peninsula, the Sinai Desert, the Arabian Peninsula. And as we look at this map in your notes that's zoomed in, here are some of the potential locations of where Mount Sinai is. I will note that this Jebel Musa is the traditional location. And that, I won't go too deeply into this, but keep in mind that just because something has been believed for a very long time, that in and of itself doesn't give concrete definitive assurance. That just gives us some certainty about what's been believed in the past. So looking at what's been believed in the past is that the location of Mount Sinai, again, is right down here. We know it's in this region and in this area, or at least I believe that it is. Some will contest that it's more over here in Midian, like we talked about last week. That is where Moses was very comfortable in that area, being a shepherd. So Moses has traveled this now at least twice, if not more than that. But this time he is bringing the entirety of God's people with him. So as they travel from Mount Sinai, they begin their journey, and it's outlined pretty quickly. So Exodus 14, they cross the Red Sea. Exodus 19, they arrive at Mount Sinai. So from here to here, and then from Exodus 19 all the way through the end of Deuteronomy, they are traveling once more back up to where we have on this image right here that I'm moving my cursor around, Kadesh Barnea. And from that point, we notice that they make a few different loops for 40 years of travel, and then they eventually make their way up into the edge of the Jordan River, by the end of Deuteronomy into the beginning of the book of Joshua. So not pictured in this map, but up above the Dead Sea, remember, is the Jordan River. So they would have actually kind of exited the wilderness and come around and up to enter into the land of Canaan across the Jordan from the east. So here are two possible routes of their time in the wilderness, but keep in mind they would have traveled all over this area in the course of 40 years. Because keep in mind, if you're again looking down here at the key to this map that tells you, and I'll try to do better about measuring in kilometers because I know that y'all are much more comfortable with the metric system. So if you're looking at kilometers, the wilderness in and of itself is between 250 to 300 kilometers wide at its widest point. So over a span of 40 years, they're going to be able to travel that quite a few times. But also note, when you're looking at a massive number of people, travel would have been very slow. So looking at, if our entire group, if our entire class, if we started traveling together, we would be able to move at a pretty brisk pace, at a pretty fast pace, compared to if there were a few 100,000 of us up into the millions. So there are a very sizable number of Israelites that are traveling. And there are debates among scholars of exactly how many Israelites that were. There were, but no matter what number is decided on it, it's a large enough number that would have made travel very, very slow. So looking, you have the Sinai wilderness looks like this, as I wrote right here, 60,000 square kilometers. It's rocky, it's arid, it's sandy, it's desert. And as they are traveling through, they are learning a lot about themselves and they're learning a lot about their God as they are doing different things like trying to test Moses and Aaron, as they are complaining amongst themselves, as they're at some moments crying out to and needing God's help and trusting in God. At other times, they don't want anything to do with the God that has brought them out of Egypt and is keeping them alive. Any questions or comments up to this point when it comes to the wandering in the wilderness, the geography of it? Okay. The conquering of the promised land. We are moving down to, this is now page 3 of your notes. The conquering of the promised land. It picks up with crossing the Jordan River in Joshua chapter 3 to enter into kind of the center, the middle of the land of Canaan. I will pause, and this is very important, not for biblical geography, but for us to understand the story of God's people. Whenever they crossed the Jordan River in Joshua 3, what would that have reminded them of?
The Red Sea.
When they crossed the Jordan River in Joshua chapter 3, what would that have reminded the Israelites of that they had done
Remind them,
before?
reminding them of the crossing of the Red Sea. Huh? You can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now. Yes, sir.
Is it reminding them of the crossing of the Red Sea?
Yes. That there is there's an image, a symbol, I guess we would call it, of new beginnings that come by water. You notice it with Noah and the flood. We notice it with the crossing of the Red Sea as they're entering into something new. And we again notice it here with the Jordan River. And after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, remember, there is an entire new generation that is entering into the promised land. So, a generation that has died out, that generation that crossed the Red Sea has died out. Therefore, all that's left is the story and the memory of the crossing of the Red Sea. Well, God begins their new journey by reminding them that He is the same God that was with their fathers. He is the same God that parted the Red Sea, and he's the same God that's going to give them the land of Canaan. So
Okay.
as they're entering in, they are reminded of the God that they're following and the God that's protecting them. They are reminded that what they're coming into is a very new beginning. And if you will notice, when we look at the way that Paul writes about this in First Corinthians, I believe it is the beginning of chapter 10, 1 Corinthians 10, like 1 through 4, he actually goes as far as to call the crossing of the Red Sea the Israelites' baptism. And so there are
Yeah.
big connections for us in seeing new beginnings and new life that come by water and through water. So that is where Joshua chapter 3 starts off. And looking down here at this map, we'll come back up here and cover some of these notes, but I think it's important before we start getting into some of the conquest that we look at and cover this map right here. So again, as we mentioned before, with some of the mountains that connect with God's covenant and God's presence, you have right here in the territory of the Amorites, Mount Nebo. That would be the mountain where Moses ascends and is able to see over into the promised land and into the land of Canaan. God allows for him to see it before his death, even though he will not enter into it. Then, once they cross over into the Jordan and cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan, keep in mind, I'm drawing that little red line, with a laptop arbitrarily. I don't know that that's the exact point where the Israelites crossed over, but that does seem to be a very middle point between Mount Nebo, where Moses sees the promised land, and where Jericho is. So we can deduce from looking at where Deuteronomy ends and looking at the first city that is conquered by God's people, that the crossing of the Jordan would have taken place somewhere in this region near Jericho. Um, I like this map because it shows us of all of the inhabitants of the land of Canaan that are going to be are supposed to be driven out, are supposed to be displaced. Now, look on this side of the Dead Sea or the Salt Sea, Sea of Galilee, Jordan River. We come over to the east side and we see some of the descendants of some of God's people, some of the descendants of some of the promised people. So down here, keep in mind the Sinai Desert, Sinai Wilderness, where they traveled, would have been down in this corner further. We've come up this direction into the land of Canaan. So Edom is the sons of Esau, and God made a promise and a covenant with Esau. Even though Jacob, his brother, took his birthright, God still had favor with Esau to give him land, give him territory and prosperity. And you will notice that if we look back in, give me a second, Numbers, I believe it is 20, at the end of Numbers 20, Moses tries to ask the Edomites for passage through Edom, to which the Edomite king rejects his offer, rejects his proposition, and brings out his army to stop the Israelites from coming directly through Edom. And in Deuteronomy chapter 2, I believe, 1 through 8, Moses explains in that passage. I'm going to double check that one. Explains in that passage why God would not have allowed them. Yes. The beginning of Deuteronomy chapter 2, God tells Moses, these are the sons of Esau. Um, so if you wanted to write those two out there in your notes, they're not going to be on the quiz, but it would be good for you to know that, for your own study and edification. So with the covenant God made with the Edomites, Moses and the Israelites were not allowed to drive them out and to harm them because they had had a covenant with the Lord. Looking up here into a couple other ones that you're going to know, the Ammonites right here and the Moabites right here would have been the two sons of Lot from Genesis chapter 19. Whenever his two daughters both get him drunk and have sex with him, and they produce children by their own fathers. So the incestuous children of Lot are the fathers of the Ammonite and the Moabite nation. And so these are some of the other nations that are being dealt with. Now, getting into the actual, what I'll call again, the land of Canaan proper, I know what we're about to see, part of the promised land will include land on the east side of the Jordan. But when we think about the land of Canaan, we normally think of the west side between kind of with this protective barrier of water on each side, and then the protective barrier of the desert from the bottom. That's normally what we think of when we think of the land of Canaan. So, getting into the land of Canaan proper, you have descendants of Ham. So, the Philistines right here, Philistia, would have been descendants of Ham in Genesis chapter 10. And then the rest of all of the Canaanites that they actually split off into different small city kingdoms. So they would not have had large territories for the most part, wouldn't have had large territories with many cities. There would be a single city or small little area with a cluster, with maybe a city and a cluster of a couple towns around it that were smaller with a single king. And that's why when we talk about the Canaanites, you notice there's all of these different, we call them the ites, right? Amalekites, Amorites, Hittites, Kenites, Jebusites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Hivites, all of these different ites that are descendants of Canaan. These were the different kings and kingdoms. Keep in mind when we call them kings and kingdoms, they would be be nothing compared to like the Pharaoh of Egypt and the kingdom of Egypt that they left. And the power of God was able to overcome the kingdom of Egypt. Therefore, the power of God is certainly going to be able to overcome some of these smaller kings with their different cities. The Philistines were often called, referenced outside of the Bible in different writings, referenced as the sea people or the people of the sea. They were known for being masterful when it came to boat building, sailing, fishing, etc. And I think that success is part of the reason why, though they are surrounded by all these Canaanite nations, they are able to keep this area from Gaza all the way north of Ashdod for such a long time. Looking at the people, so these are all the people that some, again, are kind of protected by God's covenant. Example, Edomites, Numbers 20, Deuteronomy 2. But the rest are the ones that God has called the Israelites to drive out and take back this land that is truly theirs. So that's what the book of Joshua does. It begins with the defeat of Jericho. And after Jericho is defeated and the walls come tumbling down, a fun fact for you: I have been to the ruins of Jericho. It was a blessing to be able to visit there. From what we have discovered and what archaeologists have uncovered from the walls of Jericho, is they actually, whenever they fell, the walls did not fall inward on the city as if there was an outside force pushing in on them. But again, miraculously, by the hand of God, all of the walls fell outward. And what that did for the elevated city is the ruins of the walls actually created a mound of rocks and blocks that the Israelites could have climbed up to enter into the city. making it actually easier for them to enter the city. Just a neat fact that we still have today. If it was an outside army or force that tore down the walls of Jericho, they would have had to take them downward from the outside in. But since it was not an outside army, it was the hand of God. We have the ruins of Jericho with walls that actually fell outward. Um, After they take Jericho again, they turn south. I don't think I have it drawn on here. I'll draw it in a different color for you. So we'll go with that size pen. So the Israelites again, they enter in from right there, and then they immediately turn south. As they turn south, they continue to be victorious, with the one exception of that being Ai, because of the sin of Achan. At Jericho, the Israelites were supposed to, quote unquote, devote everything to destruction. That would be called Herem, Herem warfare, whenever God's people devote everything to destruction. Part of the reason for that is one, that turns the victory into a sacrifice. God's people are sacrificing their victory and giving all of the spoils of war back to Him by burning everything, devoting it to destruction. And then the other thing that does is that reminds God's people that they are supposed to be different from all of the other nations around them. When another nation was victorious, they would have taken the spoils of war. But since God's people are called to be different, they are not supposed to be materialistic. They're not supposed to be greedy. They're not supposed to be worried about taking things from other people. They're instead supposed to be trusting that God is going to give them everything they need. So, as God tells them to destroy everything, Achan sins. Achan does not listen, and Achan takes some of the spoils back and hide them in their tent, hides them in his tent whenever they are uncovered. Achan is killed, he and his entire family and livestock, and that purifies the camp of sin, and Israel continues being victorious. When we turn to Joshua chapter 10, you'll see a comprehensive list of all of the kings up to this point that the Israelites defeated and destroyed. Joshua chapter 10. So, turning there, you will notice that begins in verse 29 of Joshua 10 and goes all the way through the end of the chapter. At this point, as Israel is being very victorious in the south and defeating all these kings in the south, who do you think is hearing about it, and who do you think is making a plan in the land of Canaan? Not the south, but I'm sorry.
Can you just
Hey,
repeat?
yes, I'm sorry, my headphones may be cutting in and out. So as the Israelites are victorious in the southern half of Canaan, um, who would be very nervous and who would be making plans in the land of Canaan? The people in the north.
Yeah.
As Israel is victorious in city after city throughout the south, what begins in chapter 11 is the Israelites then turn and head north, where the Canaanite kings have banded together and they are waiting for them. Here, this note right here, it mentions what we've already said, that each Canaanite tribe would have been more or less a city state, with undefined borders than an entire area. There was no king over all of the Canaanites, but each small sect or group of Canaanites would have had their own singular kingdom. And so Israel was going kingdom by kingdom and taking out Canaanites. Part of what makes this miraculous and part of what makes this by the hand of God is, keep in mind, and this is not a trick question, where did the Israelites come from as they're taking the land of Canaan? Where did they come from?
From Egypt, the wanderings. Egypt, the wanderings. Hmm?
There we go. Maybe I can hear you. Did somebody answer that? Where did they come from?
Well, is it crossing the river? I mean, from the wanderings, they were crossing the Jordan. They're now in the south. Now they're moving northwards.
Yes. So before the conquest of Canaan,
They came from
and
the what?
right,
From
they came from the wilderness. Before the wilderness, they came from being slaves in
Egypt.
Egypt.
Yeah.
This was not a people prepared for war. This was not a people with the training or the tools and equipment or the supplies. They were not they were not designed for war. But God promised them if they would step out and go to war in faith, then God would drive out every nation before them. Everywhere that their feet touched would be theirs. So
Mhm.
here is God's plan. Yes, was there something else?
No,
Okay. If y'all can if y'all can still hear me,
we hear you.
I'm gonna try and use a different microphone. I may be my previous one may have been failing me. So the allotment of the promised land is set out in Joshua 13:1. So in Joshua 13:1, there is an explanation of where each tribe's land is supposed to be. Keep in mind, I said where it is supposed to be. The division of the inheritance actually takes place before the conquest is over. But part of the reason for the division before the conquest is over is in Joshua 13, chapter 1. I'm sorry, in Joshua 13, verse 1, what does it say?
Go there quickly. 13, 1.
Now Joshua was old, advanced in years, and the Lord said to him, "You are old, advanced in years, and there remains very much land yet to be possessed."
Thank you. Their leader, Joshua, is aging, and he's aging quickly. And to make sure that everything is divided and allotted as God would have it to be, they go ahead and divide all of the land before it's fully taken. That's kind of a statement of faith if you think about it, because they are willing and they are able to go ahead and speak with certainty about what God has already promised and what God has already given. But the issue is that this map that you see, that you will need to know for your quiz, never actually fully came to be. The map, as you are looking at it, Israel never fully took all of the land of Canaan that God had promised them. Whenever we get to the beginning of the book of Judges, we notice that they instead make treaties with the Canaanites. They, instead of driving them out like they're supposed to, they said, "We have a better idea than God. We're going to make them our slaves." You would think a people that were just one generation, two generations removed from being slaves themselves in Egypt, that they would have some sympathy and empathy toward these people and not want to make them slaves, but nevertheless, that's what they decide to do. They disobey God. They don't fully take the land. So these 12 tribes, as you see it, this was the plan and this was the promise, but it never came to be. Again, I mentioned you will need to know these for your quiz. That's my second time that I'm telling you that. It's very important to know the 12 tribes, know them by name, and know where they're supposed to be. A few outliers that we'll talk about. You will notice here that there in the green there's both an east and a west Manasseh, and we can discuss that more if you want to and if we have time. On top of that, you see that the tribe of Simeon here is actually within and surrounded by the tribe of Judah. There are some tribes that are on the east of the Jordan River, but the majority of them are on the west. We even see an issue in the book of Judges whenever there is an altar that is built on the east side of the Jordan River. And the reason is because the Israelites don't want their descendants to think that their inheritance is less or worth less than all of those on the west of the Jordan River. Well, keep in mind they couldn't make a phone call and tell the other tribes what they were doing. They couldn't get on a computer or a laptop. They couldn't send a Facebook message. They couldn't send an email and tell them what they were doing. So as they are building this altar, what do you think the other tribes of Israel thought they were doing?
Idol worship.
Idol worship. They were very upset and very angry. They were ready to go to war because they thought that their fellow Israelites had begun to worship idols. And it was all a big misunderstanding in the book of Judges where they had to explain, no, we're not worshiping idols. We just wanted to put up a monument of our covenant with the Lord so that our kids know that our inheritance on the east of the Jordan River is just as valuable as the inheritance on the west of the Jordan River. Okay, are there any questions or any comments up to this point? Then we will take a break. We'll take a 10-minute break, and then we will pick up on page 5 whenever we come back. Thank you.
Okay.